Hey there, Ryan Reynolds here. It's a new year, and you know what that means. No, not the diet. Resolutions. A way for us all to try and do a little bit better than we did last year. And my resolution, unlike big wireless, is to not be a raging and raise the price of wireless on you every chance I get. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
The PC gave us computing power at home, the internet connected us, and mobile let us do it pretty much anywhere. Now generative AI lets us communicate with technology in our own language using our own senses. But figuring it all out when you're living through it is a totally different story. Welcome to Leading the Shift, a new podcast from Microsoft Azure. I'm your host, Susan Ettlinger. In each episode, leaders will share what they're learning to help you navigate all this change with confidence. Please join us. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey everyone, this is Ross Kenyon. I am the host of the Reversing Climate Change podcast, and today I have someone returning to the show. It's Grant Faber. Grant is the Direct Air Capture Hub's program manager at the U.S. Department of Energy. Prior to the DOE, he ran a consultancy focused on life cycle and techno-economic assessment, where he worked with many different startups, accelerators, and investors working on carbon removal and carbon conversion. Before that, he worked with 12, Heirloom, and the Global CO2 Initiative. Grant is extremely well-versed in CDR policy and a lot else. He's one of my favorite people to chat with, and much of the reason why is how he approaches problems, and you'll see it in the show, but just how he interacts with people in having discussions that are as complex as this one is. This conversation with Grant grew out of the episode that I did with Eric Matzner for Metal Plant, the link to which is in the show notes, and you should go check it out too. If you want the full context here, it's a good show that will get you up to speed with a lot else regarding co-production and the shape of the carbon removal industry moving forward. What you need to know to make sense of this episode is that Metal Plant spreads ultramafic rock on degraded farmland in Albania, and they also have a special brassica plant that can uptake nickel into the plant's tissue, and then that plant tissue is processed and the nickel is pulled out through a process called phytomining. I had Eric on to discuss his various go-to-market options here and how exactly he aims to sell his products and how he should structure them, because he has several options. Perhaps the two most obvious is, should he sell his carbon removal credits and regular nickel without the carbon content being discussed? Or should he embed the carbon negativity into the nickel to some extent, whether that's a carbon negative or carbon neutral nickel? Normally, a business would make this decision through determining what is most profitable, what is the least operationally complex, has lower OpEx costs, some combination of all of these financial attributes. But Eric can't approach this in a typical business sense where more revenue streams would be an unalloyed good because of something called financial additionality. One of the main attributes of perceived quality in carbon markets is called additionality. This specific type of additionality is called financial additionality. And the way that it works is that a credit is deemed financially additional if the carbon activity would not have occurred without this payment. And the payment in this case is the carbon removal credit. So if Metal Plant were in a non-voluntary carbon market world, Metal Plant would sell their carbon removal at full price and their nickel at full price. And with both of those revenue streams, they would likely be quite profitable. But in this BCM world here, does Metal Plant need the carbon removal credit being sold in order to make Metal Plant profitable? If nickel sales were already profitable before the carbon removal credit, Metal Plant may not be able to issue carbon removal credits and sell them and have access to the revenue stream from voluntary carbon market revenue. One alternative is to embed that carbon negativity into the nickel itself and then charge a premium for that product and sell some sort of carbon negative nickel. But it may not be as profitable for Metal Plant, and that could mean slower company growth. Not everyone who buys nickel cares about the carbon negativity, and not everyone who cares about carbon negativity needs tons of metal at their doorstep. And that means that might have slower company growth for Metal Plant, fewer emulators nipping at their heels trying to do something similar. And so what Grant and I were debating is what is better for carbon removal. Because if we let Metal Plant have access to VCM revenue and don't block them through additionality, some of the business that is likely to go to them would have otherwise gone to companies that do not have a co-product that they can sell. And that could stunt their growth, and their growth might be the more imperiled one relative to Metal Plant. Metal Plant has two revenue streams. Some carbon removal companies only have the ability to sell carbon removal credits, and that's all that they do. And so if we put them into the same market class and they each can market credits, so right now there's the beginnings of a possible trade war with China. Nickel, important component of so many things in the world, including batteries. What if the price of nickel goes up so much that Metal Plant is able to earn enough from nickel to functionally subsidize their carbon removal credit? So rather than charging a price commensurate with their rivals in the carbon removal market, they decided to sell it for $1 per ton. Let's just imagine a world in which that's possible. That would be, depending on the scale, market obliterating for those non-co-producing carbon removal companies. It might allow for a state of affairs where all of those companies, or several of them, go out of business because they just cannot compete on cost. What's funny about economics is no matter how far into world history we go, we never get that far away from debates over mercantilism and free trade and how macroeconomic policy should actually look. It turns out it's everywhere. I think what's important about this discussion is it's actually an invitation to you, the listener, to make up your own mind. I'm not actually trying to convince you of anything. I'm very comfortable with the idea that I might be wrong. I've been wrong about a lot. I expect it's not the last time, and that's okay. I think what's important is, are you thinking thoughts that you haven't thought before? Are you considering new combinations of ideas? I think that's where a lot of the goodness and beauty and fervent of the world comes from. That should be enough to make sense of the show. But before we cut into it, I wanted to read a brief quote from Return of the King. Near the end of the show, Grant and I are talking about potential failures of trying to solve problems from first principles. And I was enjoying a reread of Lord of the Rings recently, and this line from Gandalf really stood out to me while I was planning this show. "It is not our part to master all the tides of the world, but to do what is in us for the succor of those years wherein we are set, uprooting the evil in the fields that we know, so that those who live after may have clean earth to till. What weather they shall have is not ours to rule." One of the reasons why I have historically been uncomfortable with policy, and I'm more comfortable with it now, is that I had a desire to solve things permanently and from first principles. And as I've worked through this more and more, I am not sure that is always the smart and obvious approach I once thought it was. The solutions to today's problems will often become the problems of tomorrow, and some of our solutions will have unpredictable monkey paw revanchism to reckon with. And as I was writing that sentence, it's a little bit extra, as the kids say. But yeah, things come back to us in ways that we do not expect. And that's sort of the monkey paw dynamic here of horror that we often see. So that isn't to say that we shouldn't try to solve problems at a deep level, but we also run risks of making things worse when we do. This is something that I've only recently started to think through, but thanks for the nudge, Gandalf. It's a good thought. Okay, here's your show. Thanks, Grant, for being on, and hope you enjoy it. Grant, you are literally synonymous in carbon removal with techno-economic assessment and life cycle assessment. How did you corner the market on that? I almost never hear these terms mentioned without you getting name checked. Which publicist do you use that clearly works such magic?
Oh, it's myself and just my brain, I guess. But no, it was a diligent effort in business planning when I was starting my consultancy. Prior to my current role at DOE, when I was crafting that business plan, putting it together, I put a fair bit of effort in thinking about the marketing aspect of things. And I had been working on techno-economic and life cycle assessment for a number of years. And I guess part of it was luck as well, just kind of being in the right place at the right time. I got my start working at the Global CO2 Initiative at the University of Michigan on these topics, and there were a lot of efforts there in really communicating about the value of LCA and TEA for the carbon management space. And so we had, at the time, we're working on guidelines to provide a degree of harmonization across assessment efforts. And it was just super important. So I think both the direct work we did on developing those kinds of guidelines, but also communicating their importance across the space was definitely a huge part in getting people aware of them and their importance. So yeah, and then it turned out to be the case that a lot of different investors, Frontier and XPRIZE and these other entities began asking for LCA and TEA, and many of them would probably have done that anyway, but certainly there was a self-reinforcing property from our efforts there.
So if you're listening and you skipped the introduction that I gave, go back and listen to it, because the show's going to make way more sense if you do listen to it. I'm just going to wait right here. I'm going to put the music on, go listen to that, because otherwise this is not going to make a lot of sense. It has all the info that you need. And so I'm just going to let the music play so you can easily find your way back here. Take a quick look at the timestamp and come on right back. Actually, wait, I'm going to stop, Grant. What is my argument? Do you know, what was I arguing for? Are you prepared to lay that out? And also, do I get you right?
Yeah, I think what you were saying was that maybe that doesn't matter, or that it is the case that we could actually create a world where there is more carbon dioxide removal if we support processes that do have financially viable co-products, and that by giving these processes even more revenue from both the co-product, whether it's nickel or low carbon hydrogen or whatever it might be, as well as the revenue from the carbon credit, that we would actually be able to underwrite those processes even more, generate even more investor excitement about them, and then have those scale up even more. So we would end up with an end state where there is actually more CDR taking place, which would be contrary to the traditional defense of financial additionality.
Dang, when you do that, Grant, I can't even accuse you of being unfair and misunderstanding me. I think you actually understand me pretty well. So, do I understand you, by the way? Do I understand what you're trying to argue?
In a sense, I mean, I actually think I'm a little bit open-minded about this topic. More with the article and our discussion, I probably lean on the side of financial and regulatory additionality for the reasons that you laid out. If we truly believe that these processes would move forward anyway, and that it's kind of a binary thing, and if they have IRRs that are above their weighted average cost of capital, that these projects will just move forward, it's like, then I think the argument that supporting these processes even more would accelerate them more maybe breaks down just a bit. But I do think that's where we could dig into the premise there. So I guess I'm open-minded, but what I was hoping to do a little bit with that article that I had published and with our discussion was just elucidating these issues for all of us to think more deeply about.
Insofar as this is a meta discussion, we're using the topic at hand to explore how to productively disagree about these topics that are complex, and that I think people of good faith can come down on different sides of various debates within carbon removal or climate tech or carbon markets. I think there's a lot of room for non-canonical thinking, one might say. I think it's okay to do that. One thing I liked about it that you just said is that there are places that you will acknowledge that you are willing to hold this theory of how the world is or should be up to a certain point, and that you have cases where you can declare, if this were to be true, it negates some of what I previously believed. I think that's actually a fairly uncommon approach, and it's one that I value a lot, and it makes me think that you're engaging in good faith. And most people, when they're debating things, I don't feel like they have that mapped in their head. I think it becomes more of they might not even realize it, but it's a bit more of a fight than that. It doesn't strike me as a fight for you when you declare that your ideas only hold to a certain point. Is this as important as I'm singling out, or no?
I would think so. Yeah. I mean, I think that's just a core part of rational debate and pursuing truth is being willing to be wrong. Because if we think about what's the likelihood that we are right about 100% of our current set of beliefs, and it's like probably rather low. And so it's like, okay, there's something in my whole portfolio of beliefs about the world that's not true. And so I, obviously don't know what those things are, because if I knew what they are, then I would change my thinking on them. And so because of that, I think it demands a humble approach. And intellectual humility is certainly very valuable, but there are certainly good reasons why we can't all exercise that all of the time.
When approaching this on my end, I think what unlocked this for me was that I care about getting to the greatest reduction of ppm, parts per million, of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere on as quick of a timescale as possible. So in approaching this additionality requirement, it's like, does this serve that goal? I think if there were some way to test which of these pathways and which assumptions will we hold to make sure that the greatest reduction of ppm is actually happening, because it's possible that the projects that would not go funded in my preferred state of affairs, those projects might actually in the long run become the ones that will generate a lot of carbon removal. Or it's possible that we're hamstringing what otherwise would be very successful companies that I would like to support through not taking away voluntary carbon market revenue from co-producing carbon removal suppliers. What a sentence that is, that actually would slow us down from that ppm goal. So I think one way that we started pointing towards figuring out which of these pathways make sense is I think we agree on that goal. And if we do agree on that goal, it becomes way easier to decide, how do we quantify this and figure out which pathway actually gets us to that goal? Do you agree with that framework?
Yeah, I do. And it actually reminds me of an interesting framework that I learned in a meta-ethics course in college from, I think, a philosopher named Charles Stevenson, where the idea was, when we were debating, when people are debating about ethical topics, one way to approach that is to see, okay, where do we disagree? But then you keep going up, or I guess you could say back different levels in the argument and say, okay, so we disagree here, but let's go back to the premises that underlie both of the arguments and statements that we're making and see, okay, do we disagree on those premises? Then if you do disagree on those premises, you go back and step even further and say, well, what are the premises to those premises? And basically you work your way all the way back to what are like the fundamental beliefs we have about reality, fundamental premises we have about the way the world works. And you look for areas of compromise, or areas not necessarily of compromise, but of agreement. And then you can then, once you find those areas, begin to work forward again and say, okay, I differ from you very specifically in this very early or original premise. Why is that? And then is there a way one of us can change if we're not correct? Is there a way that we could find compromise? Or is this truly just intractable and we just completely disagree about different premises, and then it becomes more of a political fight about whoever can bash the other one's head, and more quickly becomes the one who, okay, my premises are the ones that will survive in the world. So hopefully it doesn't have to get down to that, but yeah, I think what we just described, it's like I think agree here on the goal, like rapid ppm reduction. That is our shared premise, and then we work forward from there and say, okay, what is the best way to accomplish this?
How do we move forward from there? I think I agree that is probably the most fundamental agreement, at least on this specific topic that we share. So where do we go from here to have a good disagreement? Or is it even a disagreement? That might even be pejorative framing that might be unhelpful. Maybe just a productive conversation is maybe a better way to say it.
Yeah, I think that is good. I do think it gets difficult once you start actually setting standards. And the ones who, in this case, would be determining the standard here are, say, MRV protocol developers, when they are determining whether to mint a CDR credit for a particular process, and they need to insert into that protocol or methodology, if this thing isn't, financially additional, do we mint a credit? Do we say that this thing can sell credit, it can go on our registry, it can be transacted, or do we say, no, we are not going to tolerate this? So yeah, and it's already showing up in several protocols, and shows up in isometrics. general standard, which they use to inform some of their protocols, where they talk about the need for financial additionality. And so, some of it also is out of people's hands to a certain extent, because additionality is one of the core carbon principles from the ICVCM. And so sometimes if you want to comply with their like meta standard, you might have to put additionality in your standard, even if you don't particularly agree with it. And then it would maybe take a more concerted effort across the space to get an exception to that, or try to overturn that. And I think this is where it gets into saying, okay, additionality is the current standard, for better or for worse. And if there are a number of people who believe that it is an unhelpful requirement for these credits, then the burden kind of becomes on them. Again, for better or worse, this is just kind of how it is, to put forward arguments, modeling, justifications, et cetera, for perhaps why we shouldn't use additionality. And then maybe, the whole space will move in a different direction.
I think project-based additionality in some cases might be worse than the disease it's trying to cure. Causality doesn't only happen at the project level. I think causality often takes place at a higher level. For instance, when I was introducing the debate here, it's possible that if you make these co-producing carbon removal suppliers that much more profitable, other companies will emulate them. Companies that are designed to have multiple revenue streams will be very successful and receive more funding. And even if the actual credit at that project level is not additional, encouraging other people to emulate this sort of very profitable business model might lead to new carbon removal businesses and new carbon removal credits entering the marketplace at a rate faster than the more protecting of non-co-producing entity approaches. But I am alone in that. I think almost no one agrees with me. And so as a business person, I think you are faced with a discussion of, does it matter? Even if I'm right, does it matter that I'm right? Because I might be right and bankrupt. And that's a hard decision to make. But also, I think people, in some cases, for additionality, have taken it for granted and are no longer approaching it critically. They're approaching it in this is a fact of the landscape. It's a fact of the ecosystem. And we actually don't need to be interrogating it in any way. And I wish there was a little bit more creativity or gumption with regard to it. Then again, though, I've been hoisted on my own petard on this one. So I'm also okay, just whatever I do next, I'm like, fine, it's additional, okay? I'll just make something additional. I don't necessarily think it's the best way to go, but I got to sell. I need product market fit, dang it. And this is what I'm going to do.
Yeah, it is a tricky situation, and it maybe also partially comes down to, choosing our battles. And like, there are literally only so many weeks and days and hours before 2050 or whatever other target we set. There's only so many, weeks, days, and hours before we hit 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, warming and so forth. And so, we are kind of really limited, and there's so much stuff to be done. And so then it becomes this matter of, okay, which battles, like which areas are the most catalytic for us all to focus on. And so the additionality thing, could be super worthwhile in terms of fighting if one really disagrees with it. But it could also be that there are just other pressing matters. And then, like you said, it just is how it is, and we just need to comply with it. But what I would say, potentially in response to the first part of what you shared about, other companies emulating, one might argue that if a process with co-products is not financially additional and it's already profitable, in some sense, that process kind of has an inherent advantage already. One is that, it's profitable, which is just, without carbon finance. And given the uncertainties in voluntary carbon markets, compliance carbon markets, that actually already is a massive advantage. And companies like metal plants that produce the nickel, or Equatic that produce low carbon hydrogen and so forth. I mean, these companies already actually have quite an advantage in that sense. Like, there already, you could argue, is a baked in incentive to have a process that could financially stand on its own, that doesn't depend on these carbon credits. And that itself is quite powerful. And then one could also, and so there's other, responses that I could share to that, but yeah, some of that incentive might be baked in already.
you might not encounter this as much given where you sit, or maybe you've seen a lot of this as well. Investors want businesses that have multiple revenue streams available to them or pathways to get there in the future.
Okay.
And it's also puzzling to then also be like, oh, but actually this might hamstring us for VCM revenue. So like in seeking out multiple business lines, you might end up making your situation worse or taking back a step in some way. It's a bizarre, you're being pulled in two different directions, I think, as a business person with regards to additionality in that way. I don't even know how to make sense of it. You just basically need to run the numbers and think which pathway here gets me with the social proof I need to actually run a business successfully and have buy-in from industry players. And you just need to choose on that, which is kind of a shame, but maybe that's true in a lot of different industries. Maybe that's just the decisions of how, I don't know, go-to-market is decided.
Perhaps. Yeah, it's also tricky because it could result in absurd outcomes too, where you could have a business and say they, produce hydrogen and carbon removal, and they make their process on purpose, like they intentionally make it less efficient and cost more. They use more expensive equipment, they do less efficient unit operations and so forth, so that the process is then more expensive, so that they need the carbon finance, so that they can then, so then they need that. But that's clearly just contrary to what our goal is, which is both, of course, achieving net zero, net negative at the lowest cost possible, but also just creating cheaper products for all of society to use and not being so inefficient. And so, when we start thinking about incentivizing that, it's tricky. And I do think this gets into a very interesting area of how we're defining carbon dioxide removal. And that's actually where it gets into the system boundaries part of that article that I wrote, because there's a lot of discussion going on right now about cases where CDR processes are integrated with existing industrial processes that emit more than what the CDR sub-process is removing. And then there's a question of whether those processes should be allowed to sell credits externally. So if you do CCS on an ethanol plant, you're taking biogenic CO2 and putting it into long-term storage. The ethanol plant, from its natural gas fire dryers is going to likely, and from upstream, corn production, these things emit more CO2 than what you're removing. And then there's this question of, well, do you have to apply the carbon removal as a reduction against the ethanol that's being produced from that facility, or can you carve it out? You allocate the upstream corn or sugarcane growth as well as the natural gas combustion to the ethanol product, and then the CDR just gets assigned its the incremental emissions that are associated with that. And this is not an isolated case either. I mean, it could exist for a DAC facility that is using waste heat. It exists in some sense for enhanced rock weathering, where you're applying minerals to a crop the process of growing the biomass on that crop. I mean, that just from operating the farm upstream, the fertilizers, the pesticides downstream, et cetera, could emit more than what the enhanced rock weathering is facilitating. And so, and there's, there's many more examples of this. And I think it gets into this really weird territory where, we sort of know what carbon removal is, or I like to think we do. It's like, okay, kind of moving carbon from the short carbon cycle into the long carbon cycle, or at least a more durable form in the short carbon cycle. And that's that. And so you're taking CO2 from the atmosphere, from biogenic sources, perhaps from the ocean, to induce further atmospheric uptake, and you're putting in some kind of, long-term store. And then that's kind of, in my mind, what carbon removal is. And then all this other stuff about, additionality and is it integrated with some other process, and on and on, does it use annual versus hourly clean energy matching and this kind of stuff. All of those things are like separate life cycle assessment and MRV and policy questions. But we can maybe agree that, okay, these processes are affecting carbon removal. They are affecting some, drawdown of atmospheric CO2 into longer lived stores. But then the question of, okay, does this kind of match with the incentive systems we want to set up and the long-term scalability of this industry? That's where we start to get into all these very interesting and perhaps nitpicky arguments.
I don't think it's nitpicky at all. I think this is the meat of this. If you care about the details of what you're doing being meaningful, if you get this wrong, not only embarrassing to the industry as a whole, it might prevent it from doing anything meaningful. You might actually be making things worse because you're unintentionally greenwashing some other process. Did you read that Tyler Kukla carbon plan piece that came out like a week or two ago?
I don't think so.
It's on this topic too, but he sketches out various ways in which enhanced rock weathering or other processes can be avoidances or removals depending on where you draw system boundaries. And if that's not enough to give you an ulcer, I don't know what is. Like working in carbon removal and trying to do the right thing here, you're like, wow, do we really not even have a sense of the basic science for some of this? Is it still so up for grabs still?
Oh yeah. And these areas, whether it is the additionality piece, the strictness with which we need to approach clean energy procurement, drawing the system boundaries. I mean, these are some fundamental and largely kind of unsolved questions that people are duking out in various ways. You know, the energy question, should we require annual, matching hourly, geographic, in what way, the legacy exemptions, this, that, and the other thing. I mean, there's people doing very serious modeling on these topics, trying to determine, okay, what will best facilitate the scale up of this technology? How do we not let the perfect be the enemy of the good here, while also preserving environmental integrity and reducing risk? And then there's a political element as well. We start to have vested interests arguing that they might not be arguing in good faith. You know, if you have a company and they've been working on a particular process for a very long time, they've sunk tens of millions of dollars of investor money and their own careers and reputations into something and years of effort. I mean, you're going to be pretty motivated in that situation to have the system boundaries or the energy procurement rules or additionality rules or whatever made in your favor. And you might not be arguing from a place of good faith. You might be just, doing that in a self-serving way. And now, of course, it can be difficult to disentangle because if one works on something, presumably they believe in that thing pretty deeply. So it can be difficult to disentangle, is this person making this argument in good faith or not? Maybe that gets back to the first part of our conversation where like signaling a willingness to change one's mind is maybe a piece of evidence that one is approaching something in better faith or with a degree of intellectual humility. But it's tricky. It's really, really hard.
I had to do that with Nori too. Obviously, Nori took some of these positions on additionality, and I was a part of that process. And I thought a lot about it and agreed with the company consensus there. But you do have to stare into your own heart. Like, would I feel this way were my company not oriented in this way? I had another conversation with someone who's working on a different CDR pathway. And I even asked this person, what was the directionality here? Did you start this company because of this belief, or do you now have this belief held very strongly because you have the company? And this person alleged it was the former. But then there's also that weird reflexivity question here too. Like, are you actually deluding yourself at this point in the conversation too? Like, do you need to go back some further stuff here? Like, how far back do we regress here to figure out, like, if the human brain is pretty protective of itself. I think it's important for anyone working on something to make sure that one's ego is not overly tied up in that, and that one is holding a belief for good reasons. And one way that I tested that is that once Nori was no more, like, well, I don't actually have to think this way about additionality anymore. Not that I ever had to. I could have disagreed and would have been fine, but I don't have a business interest in this anymore. How do I feel about it? I still was like left with thoughts of wondering, is this more harmful than it is helpful? And how do I know? And I think that means that there are good intellectual reasons for still engaging in this material in that way. But I think I'm kind of a weirdo like that. I don't think a lot of people think like that or are involved in chronic self-checking in the way that I am, or maybe you are as well.
Yeah, maybe it derives from too much self-criticism. Maybe we're criticized as children and it embedded itself in our brains that we always need to,
It's like a super egoic force that just has ruined our lives and turned us into ultra nerds in this way. Great.
It could be. But yeah, I think it's so important. But yeah, like you're saying, I mean, the brain is just so geared toward engaging in motivated reasoning. And it's also just so complicated when your paycheck, your like livelihood maybe directly derives from this thing. Like, it's just going to be so so difficult to wake up and just one day and say, no, I don't believe in. It's also tricky too, there is an inherent desire for, or I guess an inherent appreciation of those who can commit and who are consistent. And it's something that in politicians, for example, we very much dislike. Oh, he's a flip-flopper. And I think in those cases, it might actually, it's difficult because I want people in charge who are willing to change their minds in light of new evidence. Yeah. But at the same time, we put a tremendous degree of trust in politicians to do what we think they're going to do or they say they're going to do behind closed doors, because we don't see every part of the process. We're not in touch with it. There's so many, secret and private conversations, votes, and deliberations that go on. You want people you can trust. And generally, we trust people who tend to be consistent, say the same thing. It's also challenging, too, in terms of we don't want to, be constantly blowing up our lives. We work in carbon removal, and then let's say 2 weeks from now, we're like, wait, carbon removal is actually just greenwashing for the fossil fuel industry. We'll never be successful. I'm going to quit and go do something else. Then we go work in solar. And then 2 weeks after that, wait, I was wrong about carbon removal. I need to go back and work on that. And then, you quit your one job, then you get back in it. And you want to engage in these things a little bit slowly and thoughtfully, I guess, versus just being so overly eager to change one's mind that you just can literally never settle on anything and literally never get anything done. But at the same time, you don't want to just entrench yourself and hang your hat on some belief that, I'm just going to believe this every day until I die just because it's what I said I was going to do. And so there's probably some, reasonable and rational middle ground between these things that demonstrates a proper responsiveness to evidence, new evidence.
Could it be stating the limits to one's belief? I think if you were able to prove to me in some quantitative way that, well, one, not having weird meta conversations about additionality that slows us down overall, that could cause 6 to 18 months of intra-industry wrangling to figure out what to do with that and how to rewrite standards. And that time might be more valuably spent just deploying stuff according to the standards that we already have. That's an argument that could persuade me. They could also persuade me that those non-co-producing carbon removal suppliers actually need the support. If they don't get this kind of support and protection, they might not actually be able to scale. And that's where a lot of the scale is going to come from. And therefore, according to my own stated values, I should prioritize that. And I think merely by saying that out loud, I'm saying, all right, I'm willing to change my minds if those conditions are met. And that way I am receptive. An empirical case could be made to me, and if it was satisfactory. Alternatively, you could say this and no quantification could ever be truly satisfactory. And that would create a burden of proof that would be impossible for you. I would just demand increasing evidence, run the numbers for me in 1,200 different ways, Grant, and prove to me that this is the case. But I think maybe something like that is a way where stating your beliefs in that this is what would need to happen for me to change my mind. I don't know. I feel a little bit liberated even saying that. It's nice to not even have to hold on to something so tightly that you can't change your mind.
I think that makes sense. I think it's, one can sit down and say, these are the beliefs I hold now for these reasons. And I would be willing to change my mind if I were confronted with this evidence or if these questions were answered definitively in a certain way. And then as long as you're approaching that process itself in good faith and not setting super unreasonable standards or just questions that are just impossible to answer or would require a ridiculous degree of resources to answer or something like that. Okay, there's pretty reasonable conditions under which one is willing to change their mind, and maybe being transparent with yourself and others about that process. That seems to be a decent approach to doing that. And then, you can just keep your eyes peeled for new evidence. And if there are actors that say are very interested in getting you to change your mind about something, then they kind of know what the standard is to make that happen. So I don't know, that seems reasonable.
What are some other either biases or things that you've noticed in thought patterns within our industry that are less helpful than you might otherwise wish to see? Or alternatively, what are some cases of mind changing that you've seen that have earned your respect or made you think that that would be a great thing for others to emulate?
I had a feeling you would ask something like this, and I tried to think of good examples and was struggling to look them up. But yeah,
Kind of rare, I think.
yeah, mind changing.
Robert Hogan's changed his mind on things a couple of times too, where I'm like, oh, temporary removals are back in now? Like what? And that was sort of a jarring, fun one, but I can't think of that many.
Yeah, I think we had chatted about Noya changing from the cooling tower,
Right.
reliance on cooling towers to maybe more traditional DAG process, so there was a pivot there. Yeah, but I don't know if pivot, is a company pivot, I guess it is changing one's mind, but it's somewhat to be expected for a startup, because you're exploring a lot of different options, and so you go down a path, and sometimes you realize, hey, this material, this design, this isn't really going to work, or this business model, we tried it out, talked to people, but we thought it was going to work, but now no. And in fact, I think that's the driver behind some of these sayings out there. Oh, I would always invest in a A team and a C business over a A business and a C team or whatever, because you're sort of betting that they're going to have to pivot. So that's maybe just somewhat to be expected. There's different direct air capture designs that over time, some researchers have looked into, and it's like, not totally going to go down this path. There are things that maybe are proposed in literature, and then the industry just goes in one direction. Just after a bunch of companies investigating certain pathways, then it's almost like an emergent property where everybody says, oh, we're going to, move away from a membrane approach more to a solid sorbent, like a packed bed, laminate sheet, or monolith type approach. It's just, you just kind of, in the beginning, take a blue sky approach, then the industry kind of settles on something over time, which is, I guess, in a way, sort of changing your mind, or at least making a decision about something.
Not to put you on the spot with those that have failed to do this, or there's plenty of bad faith arguments that I see where I'm like, oof, that is not what that person said. That is not arguing in good faith.
Yeah, I'm struggling to come up with specific examples. I mean, I think the area where I'm seeing a lot of debate right now are in these topics that we've touched on a bit today. So I'll say the additionality piece, because there are, many new CER companies that are looking at co-products but that just inherently have co-products. So that's big. Energy procurement is a fascinating area where there's been a ton of discussion, just given the now shortcomings in the unbundled renewable energy certificate market. And so how do we, before we get to a world where either the grids are entirely clean on the margin, or you can rely on clean behind the meter power for a given facility, if you have to plug into the grid, what do you have to do to ensure that whatever power you're drawing is clean? And there's tons of debates about, okay, do we, kind of track some of the EU's low carbon hydrogen requirements, where we say, oh, we're going to have these 3 different pillars of incrementality / additionality of that power, temporal matching and geographic matching, and with the temporal matching on an hourly basis? Or can we do this whole other paradigm of something called emissions matching, where you just draw whatever power you want from the grid where you are, you calculate the emissions associated with it, and then you underwrite an amount of low carbon power in your same or a different grid region that just offsets or mitigates the amount of emissions that you're creating from your additional power draw. And there are kind of these two camps of like the hourly matching and the more flexible emissions matching, and they're kind of doing battle with one another. Modeling and arguing about, this is the incentive this would create, that's what this would create, how would we track this data, what about the changing baselines, and so on and so forth. So that's definitely a big area. And then this final system boundaries piece as well, like how close can a CDR process be to a so-called net emitting process, in a way that doesn't create bad incentives and like entrench net emitting systems, when in fact what we're trying to do is be net negative. So how do we balance that with the need to scale up and to integrate where we can with existing industrial resources? And so these are kind of 3 very active areas, I think, where we're going to see some interesting discussions and decision-making over the next few years.
Assuming that one does want to engage in discussions on any of those topics or any of the other myriad problems facing carbon removal and adjacent industries, Are there any techniques that you do to, I don't know, run heuristics on yourself to make sure that you are approaching this in a way that you believe becoming of one sincerely interested in the climate?
Well, I think that in terms of direct things, I wrote a couple of these Substack articles on these topics, in part to actually think through these topics for myself. So yeah, I'd written one a while back on navigating clean energy procurement, and then another one on, as you mentioned, on the co-products and system boundaries. And for me, writing these things out and being forced to be really I don't know, you could say diligent in researching these because they're being communicated on a public forum, has really helped me expand my thinking here. So yeah, I think that's just writing through and being really sort of taking a super blue sky approach to that is valuable. Engaging with people, engaging in dialogues, discussions, and especially with people with whom you don't agree is fundamental toward changing one's mind. And, especially in our era of echo chambers and this kind of business, intentionally engaging with people who have different beliefs than you do is probably key to keeping an open mind. And then for CDR specifically, engaging with MRV protocol developers who do a lot of thinking about these, and definitely if they're doing their jobs, stress test the expected outcomes of different decisions they might make for different parts of their protocol. I mean, I think that is a fantastic way to really level up, assuming, they're willing to speak with you. It's a fantastic way to level up on some of these topics.
I associate you strongly with being a master of the edge case. Even when we were talking about co-production, being willing to name edge cases that would obliterate what you would want to see happen, mostly about a supplier intentionally making their process less efficient to have access to VCM carbon credits. Okay, that is a possibility under what I'm proposing. Here's either what I plan to do about it, or I think even more trust building is to say, I don't actually know what to do about this yet. Someone could engage the process in bad faith and do this, and it is a problem for my way of thinking, and we need to deal with it. I think admitting that, I think people think it looks weak, but I actually think it makes you look very strong. If you don't know where your ideas no longer hold, you probably don't either understand them that well, or you're using motivated reasoning in some way and being self-protective in a way that is not allowing you to truly engage, because all ideas have downsides to them too. Basically any political philosophy you can think of, someone very smart has been well, what about this case? This challenges your sense of justice by your own terms, doesn't it? You either have to bite the bullet and say, yes, but it's worth it for these reasons, or just say, that is true. That is the downside here, and it's a problem, and I can't be expected to cover lifeboat ethics in addition to everyday morality and everything else. I think just being able to do that, well, I don't know, maybe for an average person, maybe it does look weak. I don't know. But for someone like me reading, I'm okay, wow, that's a confident, serious person that's willing to say, yeah, that I don't have a good answer for that yet.
Good. Well, yeah, my masculinity likes being strong. So let's spread this narrative to all. People look strong when they pose the edge cases. But no, 100%. And, I've been in situations before where I'm writing guidance or standards or rules for some, competition or funding or whatever it might be. And sometimes there will be an edge case that I think of as I'm writing this. And sometimes there's this little temptation, maybe I just shouldn't address this edge case here and it'll just work itself out. And then any time that I've ever done that, literally the edge case immediately comes up and is immediately posed. And it's great. I wish I would have, considered this when writing this guidance or whatever. So yeah, I think it's so important to think through all those possible edge cases. And then that's what helps us arrive at a more defensible framework. I mean, it's sort of true. And it's almost like a software engineering mindset too. If you've ever, coding, you have to write all these test cases. If you just write the basic test cases that you sort of already know a priori that your code is going to be able to handle, well, it's not that interesting. But it's the edge cases, where you can really reveal structural bugs in your code. And then the idea is if you have a very comprehensive suite of those edge cases in your testing set, then you can really reveal areas of weakness or and hopefully eventually work toward a very robust just work toward very robust code. So yeah, I think it's not dissimilar.
Well, you said a priori, so we have to talk about philosophy. It sounds like you did this to yourself, Grant, but do you feel like your philosophy training helped you in this way? Because you also seem very quantitatively oriented as well. Like you're a mix of skills.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I do think that was very helpful. And really, I only took like a few philosophy courses in undergrad, but I think even just those were just fantastic for really pushing me to, I think, be more rational and open-minded and just have better tools and frameworks for thinking about the world. Yeah, I mean, one of the major examples for me when I changed my mind about something was when I went vegan about 7 years ago. And I was actually, there were multiple factors, but one of the big ones was I was arguing with some person on an online forum about, well, what if plants can feel like we're eating a bunch of plants and that could, cause suffering or whatever. And then the person was like, yeah, but if you eat animals, then, those animals would eat even more plants and then some of the, energy from them would be wasted. So in fact, if you eat, animals, animal products, so it's kind of a weird, argument. But reading that made me think, wow, if I personally am really, dedicated to my stated view of minimizing suffering of sentient life, and I can pretty easily just change my diet to help facilitate, increased compliance with my stated worldview, then I kind of have to do that. And so then I approached my, now wife and very good friend and told them about this whole situation. We talked through every aspect, and we all collectively, we were actually at a Mediterranean restaurant, like eating some chicken dish or something. And then at that time we were like, yeah, we basically just need to go vegan if we want to be, consistent with ourselves. And so then all three of us went vegan right then and there. And then, now it's 7 years later, we're all still like that. And, that was just a huge example for me of like realizing, wow, I'm like wrong about this thing. And if I want to be consistent with my personal values, I need to make a pretty substantial change in my, behavior. And so, yeah.
Pretty deep answer, Grant. Didn't know we were going to go that direction.
Yeah, no, I think it's, and it sounds a little silly, I guess, with the forum like I'm arguing with this person on a forum, but that kind of opened my eyes, a little bit to the flaws in my arguments. And that was, just one argument. We argue about other things as well, but yeah, I want to be that kind of person. And I think going back to what we were saying before about, liking when people share edge cases, even if it's contrary to their own position, that like we should try to create a culture that rewards this, because our brains are just so wired to operate in the opposite direction. And so another short story I can share is that during college, I had actually several classes, and so did some of my roommates, where we learned about cognitive biases and motivated reasoning and these things. And so we actually made it a game to, when any one of us was having some kind of personal problem or something, to point out when the other ones were, hey man, that's sunk cost, that's motivated reasoning, that's straw man, whatever. And we literally made it like we totally gamified pointing out each other's bullshit. And it was just fantastic because it really just helped. It sounds a little silly, but like it helped us all be more rational in our decision making rather than just reinforcing each other all of the time. And it can be a little bit cognitively tiring to live like that, which is another reason probably why many people don't do it, because it is a big cognitive load to bear when you're constantly evaluating and reevaluating all of your positions, and you're surrounded by people who might call you out if you say something that's inconsistent or something. So there's probably a way to do it a little bit more, nicely or comfortably. But yeah, it's if we can create that culture that rewards intellectual humility and changing one's mind in light of new, like, real evidence. I mean, that just seems like one of the main and best ways that we have to counter our brain's wiring.
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, you've operationalized pedantry there. Sounds like a tough crew to roll with. But I had a friend recently ask me, they said that they were very interested in history, but didn't know where to start. And obviously that's an enormous question, and it depends so much on personal interest. But one thing I tried to do was to bring historians of different schools to bear, be like, this person is like really good at this one way of seeing things. And this other person, it's totally different. They would disagree. They probably wouldn't like enjoy a beer together. But hopefully between the two, you get a parallax view where you can start to make sense of different ways of understanding. Because obviously history is not, George Washington crossing the Delaware, and that's like that happened on Christmas Day. We're like, who cares about that? Everything important in history is up for grabs and is being debated constantly. And as long as you can understand the debate, I sort of hate that the phrase teach the controversy is held in such bad esteem now because of intelligent design debates. But I think actually for history and various other philosophies like this too, teaching the debate is the entire thing. Like you need to be able to think through, well, this person's really smart. I might disagree with them, but wow, they posed a challenge here. I don't know how to do this. Are there any belief systems out there that you do not have to bite the bullet for? I think basically all of them have some edge case where someone will go, actually, well, what have you thought about this? And you're like, that's terrible. I got to live with that now. Or I need to change my beliefs. But any belief that you would change to, there's no Pareto optimal belief system that results in always improvement. You just trade off one bad consequence for one other one. Is there some sort of pure thing that we can drive to anywhere?
If you're familiar with long-termism at all, and maximizing utility, not just for those alive today, but for those who will be alive into the far future. And if we believe that humanity will continue and there will be trillions upon trillions of people and other forms of sentient life going, into the far, far future, then you could argue that, well, we should actually reorient all of society today, even if it's incredibly painful, to ensure one, the continuation of society into the far future, but two, the maximum utility for these people going forward. But then that could have some very negative consequences for what society needs to look like today. And so, what I'm driving at there is like, it maybe seems basic to say, oh, we should try to aim for the best for all people alive today and in the future. But I think that itself could end in some gnarly consequences if you really take it to its extremes, or there could be certain edge cases or framings where even such a thing that seems so basic like that, like more good for humans, could be construed in a difficult way and problematized. So I don't know. All beliefs might feature some kind of trade-off by virtue of being beliefs.
I'm somewhat suspicious of first principles based thinking or a prioristic deductive systems in general at this point. I think I used to be much more sympathetic to them, and I think I'm much more empirical and willing to change at this point, and also just want things to broadly work. So one of the reasons why I stopped working in philosophy was I thought I was getting closer to a foundational system of ethics that had sort of self-evident axioms that could be built upon to create a system that would be universalizable in some way. I know many philosophers have died upon these rocks in the past, dreaming the impossible dream of ethical philosophy. The department I was doing PhD coursework in was a post-Rawlsian department, and they had gotten into the idea that Rawls's earlier work had specified that from the original position, behind a veil of ignorance, not knowing who you would be in society, people would choose an egalitarian distribution of resources. And then post-Rawlsian came around, and later Rawls too, but came around and said, people of good faith can choose a less equal civilization, but one that produced more wealth overall. Someone could choose that. They're not only going to be so conservative that they're only going to choose strict egalitarianism. And then once there's multiple legitimate answers to the original position, all bets are off for Rawlsian political philosophy. I've never been able to figure out how anything is supposed to work after that point. Many smart people have, I'm told, but I've never really figured it out. And then that plus postmodernism really blew me apart in questioning language and power and all the other things that go along with that. I think no longer having access to a single source, a foundational truth, like a one right answer to that, has led to me having more comfort with democracy, more comfort with disagreement, more comfort with the slow, uncomfortable march of policy backwards and forwards and this triangulation between interest groups. I used to just find it all unphilosophical and painful. And I think as I'm getting older, I'm understanding the value of that a bit more. I don't know if you've had a parallel experience in your life or you came at a different way, but that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah, I think that was very beautifully put. And I would say, yeah, I'm in agreement. I also had a sort of similar evolution with Rawls, because in the beginning I was very captivated by, maxi min. But then as I thought about it, it's like, wait a second, wouldn't a utilitarian just approach that and say, I would actually be willing to structure a society behind the veil of ignorance that has 1% of people have pretty bad lives, but the other 99% have these fantastic lives. And then, well, if you're a gambler, well, then yeah, I'll take the risk of being the 1% person with the bad life, so I can be in this 99%, And so it's well, yeah, it just completely breaks down. And I read a book on Foucault as well, and yeah, that kind of it opens one's mind a little bit. So I think that it is difficult, but I think there is. I don't want to be like, oh, there's not realities and truths. I mean, we work in a very scientific field. But maybe there's a difference between, hard science. And I know there's other people who know way more about this. And I think, you've spoken about this before a little bit as well, but just maybe there's a difference between gravity's a thing and this amine has a, 1.5 millimole per gram absorption capacity. There's maybe a difference between that and morality writ large. So, but anyway, I think maybe it's, in terms of that, it could provide us a bit of an opportunity. A way I've thought about it sometimes is that because, the mind and social systems are malleable, that does provide us somewhat of an opportunity to change things for the better and to structure a better world. Now, of course, that can go the other way. But if we're fairly confident in some of our goals and ends, whether it's something as specific as, I want, this form of carbon removal to operate at scale, but even as broad as I want, human society to live in a regenerative and harmonious way with nature. Maybe if there is more flexibility and less rigidity to our social systems, we might be, the chances of us affecting those changes might be a little higher. So maybe that's positive.
I think the turn towards very practical, operational style thinking here of, okay, policy is almost inherently going to be imperfect. Even if you write it perfectly, administering it seemingly will result in some weird things happening down the line. A lot of policy actually changes at the point of deployment and administration anyways. Thanks for being here, Grant. I'm so happy we got to do this. Thanks for just making me think. I appreciate that almost more than anything else in my work. So thanks for being that person for me. And just thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you, Ross. It's a very, very cool conversation. Very much enjoyed it. Thank you.